This is the web transcription service of the Royal Canadian Military Institute. On April 24th, the RCMI and the NATO Council of Canada co-hosted a special luncheon event with guest speaker Edward Lucas, a senior editor of The Economist, specializing in Russian affairs. Lucas spoke to a very full room on the subject of Russian intelligence after Snowden and shared his views on developments in the Ukrainian crisis.
Well, thanks very much indeed for that very gracious welcome and for turning out in such large numbers on such a fine day to talk about these gloomy things. I'm going to talk for about half an hour and then look forward to an extended Q&A session. I particularly like questions that are hostile, so if you just want to say that you've read all my books and think they're wonderful and why don't more people agree with me, that's fine. We can talk about that informally. I much prefer questions that say you've got it all wrong and here's why. Also, as part of the after-sales service, I'm on Twitter, and you can follow me there. I'm an inveterate tweeter, and if I come across anything interesting, mainly to do with these issues of Russian foreign policy, the crisis in European security and cyber, I do tweet as Edward Lucas. And also, if there's anything you just want to follow up with me afterwards, you can email me. I'm very easy to find. I'm edwardlucas@economist.com. It's very good seeing Snowden and Russian intelligence linked in the title, because for a lot of people that would be a bit like saying Snowden and the world banana crop. These are two completely separate things. Snowden, at least according to many of my media colleagues, is a hero, and Russian intelligence is a very marginal threat that only a few crazy people obsess about. And I wrote this book called The Snowden Operation, really to have a crack at my colleagues in the media, who I've nicknamed the Snowdenistas, which is a name they absolutely hate, and I encourage you to use it at every opportunity. What particularly annoys them is that they thought that this was somehow to do with the Sandinistas. And I said, no, it's nothing to do with Sandinistas, it's to do with fashionistas, as in unthinkingly going after whatever's trending. And so I wrote a short ebook, which is eventually, I think, will come out in print form, but it's available on Kindle for the princely sum of, I think, 99 US cents. I don't know what it would be in Canadian dollars, but it's not expensive. Really just to point out a few things about Snowden that people don't realise. And I'm going to go into them first and then get on to Russian intelligence, and then at the end of the talk I'll see if there's possibly a connection between Snowden and Russian intelligence, which I can only conjecture about, but I think there's some quite interesting evidence for it, and I get into that also in the book. So I think the first thing about the Snowden so-called revelations is the astonishing naivety and hypocrisy which has accompanied their release. You would think that we didn't have intelligence agencies. We had no idea that something called the NSA existed. Or maybe we thought they sat around all day playing Sudoku. But the absolutely shocking central revelation of the Snowden files, if you call them that, is that we have intelligence agencies and they conduct intelligence operations. And boy, are we cross about that. And the crossness is particularly acute, I find, paradoxically, in countries that have very effective intelligence agencies of their own, such as Germany. And what I found the sort of single most bizarre paradox of this entire thing, I think occurs in the pages of Der Spiegel. Now, I guess in an audience like this, probably a few hands might go up, but has anyone here heard of an organisation called the, in English, the Strategic Intelligence Office, or in German, the Kommando Strategische Aufklärung? Very good. It's the German NSA. It's very good at its job. It's a little bit more secret than the NSA, and it doesn't really have a kind of press office and so on. But in Der Spiegel about 3 years ago, there was an incredibly appreciative profile of the KSA by Spiegel, which in journalistic parlance has a name which is so offensive I wouldn't use it in polite company. But it was one of those sort of articles. And it said basically, aren't we fantastic? We've got this amazing intelligence agency and they can listen to drug barons in Kosovo, they can listen to people in Afghanistan who are planning to attack our troops, they can listen to Russians who are trying to do people smuggling into Germany. Isn't this fantastic? They've got global reach, they've got the best code crackers, the best intelligence. 3 cheers for the KSR. At no point in that article did it ever say, isn't this against the law in some of the countries that they're doing? No, it was just undiluted 100% appreciation. And so I find that particularly the idea that the Germans are upset about intelligence agencies doing things is really bizarre. And as we've got some Estonians in the room, another reason I'm upset is that I revealed in my book Deception, which came out a couple of years ago, that Germany and Russia had jointly conducted an intelligence operation on the territory of a NATO ally, recruiting and running a senior defence official called Hermann Sen. That's quite bad, actually. I mean, even by the murky standards of espionage. The Germans did apologise rather grudgingly to the Estonians for this afterwards. But again, the idea that the Germans are on some kind of moral high ground when it comes to intelligence, I think was a bit bizarre. And so you've got a lot of naivety and hypocrisy. You've also, I think, got a startling absence of a smoking gun. Sure, we have lots of evidence about NSA programmes, often drawn from internal presentations, which tend to have a slightly boastful tone to them. But
can we speak louder, please?
I'm sorry. Yes, I'm not sure. Maybe. Shall I? How about that? Is that any better? I'm sorry. I can't hear myself speaking. If you see what I mean. But I think there's been a striking absence of a smoking gun. When this first came out, I assumed that amid all these cherry-picked documents would be signs of real illegality, of systematic attempts to mislead Congress, to break the law, building up extensive dossiers of the American administration's political opponents based on intensive spying on their private lives. And there's been nothing of the kind. There's been absolutely nothing of the kind. We have this kind of phony Love Inc. scandal, which shows that some members of the NSA broke the law in using their position to spy on their love interests. And that's bad. And they were disciplined, and I think they should be prosecuted and fired. And I've said in my book that I think that intelligence officers have enormous privileges, and when they abuse that privilege, the punishment should be exemplary. And I'm cross to the NSA, they didn't do that. The NSA pondered the idea of using the fact that they'd found out that some jihadist preachers had deviant sexual habits involving underage sex and child pornography, that if this was released to these people's followers, it might damage their standing as apostles of the Islamic truths. But they didn't do this. This was on a training slide. It was, this is the sort of thing we could do. Should we do it? Answer no. So there's been a real absence of smoking gun. What has come out is, I think, has been very damaging. And I'll get into that in the next part of the talk. But it hasn't shown to me that the NSA or its allies in Britain or elsewhere are rogue, out-of-control agencies which are deliberately flaunting the Constitution. Yes, they're very legalistic. If the law says they can't do it, they say, OK, the law says we can't do that. Is there another way we could do that? Well, unfortunately, that's the way America works. It's exactly the way that Wall Street banks work. They're told something's illegal, they go to their compliance officers and say, can you find a way in which we can do this legally? It doesn't mean it's right, but at least it's legal. So I'm upset about that. I wish that America didn't have this legalistic culture, but the NSA is certainly not the only place that it affects. Now let's look at the damage, because I think whistleblowers have to meet a proportionality test. They have to say that what they're doing, what they've exposed, is wrongdoing of such a kind that there's no other way of dealing with it than blowing the whistle, and that the benefit of blowing that whistle outweighs the harm that's going to be done. And I don't think Snowden met either of those tests. I don't think that he used the channels that were available to him within the NSA. And I think the proportionality case, he fails in an absolutely glaring way. If he had just taken, for example, the Verizon court order and related documents and said, look, I think the American people have the right to know that their telephone metadata is being systematically acquired by the NSA through these secret court orders, I would have answered, well, it's a secret court. It's the FISA court. It's meant to operate in secret. I don't see there's anything wrong doing that. But I think if he produced that, he could have said there was some kind of public interest to what he was doing. But he didn't do that. He did far, far more, 1.7 million documents, and taken in a way which is paralysing from a damage control point of view. Now, I guess many people here will have a background in the intelligence services and will know this already, but the basic principle of damage control is that if something goes missing, or may have gone missing, you have to assume it's gone to your worst enemy. They will make the most damaging interpretation from it, and then you operate accordingly, because you can't run an intelligence service on the basis of it'll probably be all right. You can run an economic policy on it, it'll probably be all right, but intelligence is close to engineering. Bridges fall down if you get them wrong. And in intelligence services, people die if you get things wrong. And so if you lose just one document, that's already a serious breach. People get fired, careers end. Now, if you lose two documents, that's not just two separate incidents. You have to think what happens if these two documents simultaneously fall into the wrong hands, because each of them may be innocuous on their own, but put together there could be an inference that could be very damaging. 3 documents, even more. And it's the maths of the factorial. 10 times 9 times 8 times 7 times 6 times 4 times 3 times 2 is all the possible combinations. That's a very big number. Once you get to 1.7 million, it's terrifying. So even from a purely operational point of view, without all the sources and methods that have been compromised, the way Snowden stole his documents and the unclarity about the nature and extent is already extremely damaging for my country's intelligence service, for the Americans, and I infer for yours. So that's very bad. Then you've got the fact that he's given away stuff that we do, quite gratuitously. I go into this in the book. I don't see what is in the least public interest in showing how dictatorships are spied on by democracies. We should be spying on China. We should be spying on Russia. We should be spying on Iran. And for those reasons, we should be spying on Germany, because they are, to a large extent, breaching sanctions to Iran, have a special relationship with Germany, and do all sorts of dodgy, with Russia, and do dodgy deals with China. But it's in our interest. We should be doing that. And none of the Snowdenistas, it's the question I ask them again and again and again, why is it in the public interest to reveal how a country like Sweden, in cooperation with the Americans, spies on Russia? Glenn Greenwald, the Pope of the Snowdenistas, he would dislike that as well, so please use that if you ever can. The Pope, the Snowdenistas Pope, was asked on Swedish television about this. And he said, well, it's just outrageous. This wasn't even spying on the Russian government. They were spying on private companies. They were spying on Gazprom. It's just an energy company. Hello? That, to me, exemplified the naivety and stupidity of the Snowdenistas. If you think Gazprom is just an energy company, you better do some reading and shut up, because the only question is whether the Kremlin is the political wing of Gazprom, or whether Gazprom is the energy arm of the Kremlin. But the idea there's something wrong about a country like Sweden, with American help, spying on Gazprom is ridiculous. There's also been huge damage to Western unity. We already had a very serious problem in European security of the growth of neutralism. After the Georgian War, the most scary opinion poll I saw was an opinion poll in Germany which said if the Baltic states, your NATO allies, were attacked by Russia, should Germany offer them military assistance within the NATO framework? The majority of Germans said no. It's got worse since then. It really has got worse since then. The latest polling from Germany shows a majority of Germans saying that in the event of a conflict between Russia and the West, should Germany be firmly part of the West, or in what they call a mittlerer Position, middle position? Majority says middle position. Snowden's revelations have stoked that sentiment. Many Germans quite sincerely believe that America is a greater threat to world peace than Russia. It's bonkers, but they believe it. And all this stuff about the NSA makes them think that America is some kind of rogue state that goes around the world, hoovering up data, interfering in people's privacy, stealing things, doing all sorts of bad stuff. And Germany has no business cooperating with them. So that's very bad. Now, of course, all this fits Putin's agenda very nicely. Putin needs the West to be divided for these things to work. If you cast your mind back to the Cold War, when you had take a sort of slightly similar country like Yugoslavia during the Cold War. Yugoslavia had sort of been part of the Soviet bloc, then it got away. Russians weren't very happy about it. Russians were unhappy about Yugoslavia's relations with the West. There is no way that the Kremlin, under Andropov, under Brezhnev, under Khrushchev, or under any of them, would have attacked Yugoslavia, because they would have known the West won't stand for it, even though it's not a member of NATO. We had the existence of NATO had a deterrent effect much wider than just Article 5. And the fact that Putin's getting away with this in Ukraine, just as he got away with it in Georgia, and just as he's got away with a whole bunch of other stuff, is a sign that our deterrent posture is much weaker than it was. And the central reason for that is disunity. Now, I just want to look a little bit at what's been going on in Ukraine, because I think Russian intelligence plays an absolutely central role in this, and one that hasn't been fully appreciated. I commend to you, and this is not yet published, but it's going to be published next week, and they're just proofreading it, but if you don't mind the fact that on one page the word thirdly appears twice in the same paragraph, when it should be fourthly, it's basically ready. This is from the National Defence Academy of Latvia, Centre for Strategic Security and Strategic Research, and it's about Russia's new generation warfare in Ukraine, implications for Latvian defence policy. I think you could remove the words Latvian and just have Western defence policy, and it would still be true. It's an absolutely brilliant analysis. If you email me, I will just send you the PDF. But it highlights the way in which this war in Ukraine is very different from the sort of wars that we've seen elsewhere. Though it's actually, I think, not really new. It reminds me very much of what we saw in Czechoslovakia in 1938 and 1939. But we've grown up with the idea that a war is something like Vietnam. It's something like the Normandy landings. You have a nice declaration of war, one side attacks another, then the other side counterattacks, you go backwards and forwards, a great deal of high explosive expended on both sides, lots of people die, and at the end one side wins and the other one loses. That would be very, very convenient for us if Putin was going to do that. It'd be so handy if he would neatly and politely declare war on one of the Baltic states, give us plenty of notice, then invade with his tanks in good, nice formations. We'd attack them, he'd attack us, we'd win because we're much bigger, it would all be over and we could say we won the Third World War. Unfortunately, I think Putin's realised that Article 5 is designed to give the West an advantage in that kind of war, which is why he's not fighting it. He's fighting quite a different war. And it's a war that starts off by demoralising your opponent. You destroy your opponent's will, and then you don't have to destroy his armed forces. And we saw that really clearly in Crimea. There were plenty of Ukrainian forces in Crimea, and given a bit of notice and a better Ukrainian government, they could have put up quite a fight. They were not powerless. They could have tried getting their ships to sea, they could have turned their guns on the garrisons, on the Russian garrisons, and started shooting at them. They could have done a lot more in terms of sabotage and other diversionary tactics. They could have tried to hold the airport in order that the airport wasn't used for reinforcement. There's a lot they could do. They didn't do anything. They sat peacefully in their barracks, and then they all surrendered, with, I think, not a single shot being fired. And that was really a triumph of this new kind of warfare, where you identify your opponent's weaknesses, you build up a lot more weaknesses, and then you exploit them to the point your opponent loses the ability to defend himself. And it's quite interesting to speculate how that might play out in our NATO countries in a future conflict. I don't think that if Russia was going to attack Estonia or Latvia or Lithuania, that they would do it by marching over the border. What you would get is a bunch of Russians claiming to be locals, perhaps genuinely being locals, perhaps trained in Russia, it might be hard to tell in the heat of the moment, doing something like blockading an airfield, or maybe climbing into the airfield and sitting on the runway and saying, we don't want these NATO warplanes landing here, take your air policing home. And giving the local Estonians, Latvians or Lithuanians, and maybe their NATO allies, do we open fire on these people? These people are sitting on the runway and they're shooting at us. Do we shoot back at them and kill them? What do we do? It'd be very different, a kind of low-intensity warfare with lots of difficult dilemmas that are much closer to public order and policing than they are to military. It's very asymmetric. We have a lot of stuff that we can't use. They have a lot of stuff that we don't have a counter to. We don't have a counter to Russian television. Russian television is a really, really powerful weapon. It's the heart of their informationnaya vojna, their information warfare. They put a huge amount of money into it, both in Russian language and in English language, and they beam it into the places that they're trying to affect, and it erodes willpower. And we see it absolutely here in the English-speaking world, and in fact Russia Today comes out in lots of other languages as well. And I really commend you, this afternoon, this evening, tomorrow, just go and spend a couple of hours watching Russia Today and think, this is the message that they're sending, and people in my country and in allied countries are watching this stuff, with its mixture of conspiracy theories and of smears and of disinformation and exaggeration, highlighting all the flaws in the West, making us think that we're not worth defending, that our allies aren't worth defending. And they put a huge amount of money into that. And that's asymmetric. We have, what do we have? We have Radio Canada International. It's great. We have the BBC World Service. We have Voice of America. It's that much in comparison to what the Russians are doing. So intelligence is really important in all this. They need to know what's going on so that they can target their resources. And they're really good at it. It's not a big priority. For my country, it's not a big priority, I think, for any Western country, except possibly the Baltic states, the Poles and the Czechs, dealing with Russia. In my country, it was a bit of a career killer, really. It was a career killer being interested in Russia. It was more of a career killer being hawkish about Russia. And it was the biggest career killer of all, being hawkish about Russia and interested in Ukraine. This may be one of the reasons we're now scrambling to regain the sort of analytical capability on Ukraine that we now realise we need. But for Russia, this is the number one thing. This is what they really, really want to know about. They want to know what's going on in these target countries and what's going on in our countries and what the links are. It really matters to them. You see it particularly in Germany. I think Germany's been the number one target, really, for Russian intelligence, and boy, have they done a good job there. They've cultivated all sorts of active, passive assets, agents of influence, people who've got business connections with Russia, people who get research contracts from Russia. And it was very interesting, once this, the way this kind of pro-Russian tide in Germany has just been coming up the beach, there were 500 people signed an open letter to the German government saying we sympathise with Putin over Crimea. I can't imagine another European country where that would happen. It's been a very impressive result. And it's not old-fashioned conventional spying. They do that too. Obviously, they're interested in stealing military secrets and so on. But a lot of what they do is putting passive assets into place and just watching, finding out what's going on, and then somebody else makes an approach and says, hey, would you like a scholarship? Would you like some money for your institute? Whatever. And we've been very weak about prosecuting this. The tendency in the West, and it's changing only very slowly, really in the last 18 months, the tendency in the West, when we find Russians, unless they're caught absolutely in flagranti, is to try and hush it up. And the people they've recruited, who they've been paying, get posted elsewhere. But still, humour aside, we should be being a lot tougher. In terms of the intelligence war in Ukraine, I think that the FSBs had a brilliant war. Ukraine was their territory. This was not seen as a fully foreign country. And under the Yanukovych regime, they made hay. They really did. They went systematically through Ukrainian power ministries, recruiting people, intimidating people, finding out what was going on, homing in on people who'd been to the West in the era when Ukraine was a strong NATO partner. There were a lot of people in Ukraine who did stuff with us. And all those people felt the cold breath of the FSB down their necks. They were often interrogated by people who said they were from the SBU, with other people in the room who were clearly from the FSB. And so the FSB, I think, was the sharp end of the Russian effort in Ukraine, and it's still there. The new Ukrainian government is finding it extremely difficult to deal with that. GRU has had a very good war as well. The ability of the GRU to make stuff happen, which I think is rather greater than their ability to find stuff out, is, no disrespect to them on that, but they're the masters of the sort of short, sharp intelligence operation rather than the sort of long, subtle cultivation, in my view. But they had a very good war. I think Putin's very pleased with them, and they've recovered from the kind of downgrade that they had a few years ago. What next? Well, Europe is a single intelligence space for them. They use the Schengen zone as a single intelligence space, and we are struggling to keep up with that. Our traditional way of dealing with Russian intelligence is you monitor the embassy, try and work out who the hoods are, follow them around, see who they're recruiting. Well, that's fine. That worked quite well during the Cold War. It really doesn't work now if the people who are running operations in Belgium are coming by train from Paris. And particularly if you have countries where the counterintelligence services don't particularly get on very well, for example, because, take an entirely hypothetical example, one of them's Austrian, not in NATO, and you have Russians based there running operations all over the place, then it becomes very difficult. You may have seen that a Russian spy has just been caught in Slovakia. I just saw it in the Slovak media. I don't think it's been out in English. Senior defence official caught in Slovakia. It'd be very interesting to see where his case officer was based, but I would bet a couple of glasses of fairly expensive Austrian wine that he was probably based in somewhere in Austria. Now let's get on to where Snowden comes into this. I think I've established pretty clearly that Russian intelligence is extremely effective. It's in the foreground of what Russia does, and that playing divide and rule in the West is a major Russian intelligence priority. And the Snowden revelations have certainly helped sow disunity in the West, not actually just between allies, but also inside countries. It's made people mistrustful of their security and intelligence services just at a time when we need to be taking their advice particularly seriously. So was Snowden a Russian agent? I need some water. Can I have a glass of water? So this really is water. So let's just look at the facts. The really striking, incontestable fact is he ended up in Russia. So that's going forward. The incontestable fact is that he's there in Russia. And the Snowdenistas have all sorts of slightly cockamamie excuses for this, that he didn't mean to go to Russia, he wanted to go to somewhere quite neutral and harmless like Cuba, but, well, he couldn't get a visa for Cuba, or he couldn't get a plane to Cuba, and so, well, he went to Hong Kong because, although he'd been planning this for months, he hadn't thought about where he was going to go, and anyway, so it was just an accident, and he would love to leave Russia, and it's all the Americans' fault for keeping there. I'm slightly exaggerating the way they don't put it quite as articulately as that, but that's the basic line from the Snowdenistas. Now, I can't prove that Snowden was on the books of the Russians, but I do think that there's some pretty good facts that we can make dots, and the simplest way of joining the dots is the hypothesis, and it is only that I advance in my book. Number one, we know the Russians are really keen on recruiting American intelligence officials, and they like recruiting them at the start of their career. And we know that Snowden had a posting at the CIA based in Geneva. And we know that the kind of people they like recruiting are naive, self-confident, underappreciated people with slightly complicated personal lives who feel they're not being fully appreciated by their superiors. And Snowden absolutely fits that category. Bit of a misfit, didn't complete proper higher education, obviously not completely happy in the agency, had a job which was probably rather more basic than he thought he was capable of. And we know from his rather flamboyant and lurid remarks on social media during his time there that he wasn't particularly happy either. He had some money problems, he lost a lot of money on some sort of speculation, and he was doing all this social media stuff on an unclassified computer. And again, that wouldn't be difficult for the Russians to pick up. If you're interested in someone, you see there's a new American intelligence official, intelligence officer, you find out where he lives, don't have to be particularly talented to start being able to see what his browsing habits are, and you see he's posting all this stuff. He's clearly not very happy. So that's two dots. He's the sort of guy they'd been interested in, and he had the sort of behaviour that would have attracted their attention. And a lot of people say at this point, but of course Snowden hated Putin, he wouldn't have had anything to do with them. To which I have two very simple words: false flag. We know the Russians are really good at doing false flag operations. They used to do them all the time during the Cold War, when they would find well-meaning, patriotic, right-wing NATO officials, and they'd pretend to be from South African intelligence. And they'd say, you have to help us. And these dimwits, numbskulls, again and again, some of this has come out in public, some of it hasn't, again and again the Russians had run these false flag operations, absolutely brilliant, with people who thought they were helping the South Africans against communism. They'd also sometimes impersonate Mossad officers if they wanted to recruit someone who had sympathies with Israel. They're good at this stuff. They do false flag. They do it rather better than we do. So had they wanted to recruit Snowden, they would have certainly approached him under a false flag, pretending to be from that digital freedom hacktivist milieu, which is very easy to do because it's very wide, very blurry milieu, and you can just approach it and you can say, yeah, I really worry about all this stuff. Don't you worry about this surveillance? I worry about it too. And they could just warm him up, and they'd warm him up over a period of several years, because we also know that Russians play a very long game. They don't have auditors and scrutinisers coming in and saying, is this really value for money? They sow 100 seeds in the hope that one of them sprouts. And so they would have thought it was plenty good value for money to try and cultivate Snowden and just increase his sense of alienation from his employer. They wouldn't be looking to get any secrets to him, nothing that would arouse his suspicion, but just keep on increasing that sense of alienation, warming him up. And then all they had to do, once they decided that he was really thoroughly alienated, is just engage him in a social encounter where one of these Snowdenistas would be there. The Snowdenistas would be completely innocent, and I accuse them of being idiots and of being more than that, but I don't think that the Snowdenistas, people like Greenwald, are actually working for the Russians. I don't think they wouldn't want that. They don't particularly like Putin, they just hate America. But it'd be very easy to it'd be like putting two chemicals together and getting a reaction. You bring Snowden, the disillusioned NSA contractor, his mind full of these conspiracy theories and resentments and so on, and you just bump him into Jacob Appelbaum or Laura Poitras at a party, and they say, what are you doing? He goes, wow, you're Jacob Appelbaum. That's so cool. I've been reading about you. Maybe you could even tell him Jacob Appelbaum is going to be at this party. And then you just let things take their course. So that's my theory. I can't prove it. I've had no briefings or special information from anywhere to say that I'm right. I've also not had anyone say that I'm wrong. But I say to the Snowdenistas, this is not as bizarre as you think. You're dealing with people who do this sort of stuff. He's the sort of person they do it to. They've got a track record of doing it and doing it effectively. The end result has been in their hugely in their interest. And most of all, where is he now? He's in a place where we can't ask questions. He's in a place where his access to him is extremely tightly controlled. You go through a guy who's known as an FSB lawyer if you want to meet him. Maybe I'm just very naive. Maybe I'm just very suspicious. But I think there's something there. So on that note, I will stop and look forward to your questions. I've done, I think, just over half an hour. And as I say, hostile questions are much more welcome than friendly ones. Gentleman there with the orange bow tie.
Hi, well, thank you for this very interesting talk and very interesting theory as well. I grew up in the Netherlands in the 60s. I'm sort of a child of the Cold War, so I think it was quite different lines, but a lot of what you said sounds very familiar. Most well-meaning people in Germany and in other European countries saying that America is a far greater threat to global peace than, let's say, the Soviet Union was. One of the first Russian words I learned was desinformatia. And certainly the idea of the Western Europe being full of Russian, now Soviet agents sounds very familiar again to me. But my question is actually very simple. What, if anything, has fundamentally changed in Russian foreign intelligence, with the exception that the KGB was split up into the FSB and the SVR?
Right, for those of you who didn't hear, the question is what has fundamentally changed in Russian intelligence since Soviet days, with the exception that the old PGU is now rebranded as the SVR? Well, I think a couple of things have changed. One is that they are no longer shackled by communism. Communism was a very hard sell in the West. You could find people who were plenty anti-American, but saying to them the Berlin Wall is a good thing, we were right to invade Hungary and Czechoslovakia, there's no such thing as the Gulag and Sakharov belongs in Gorky, was tricky. Kim Philby would believe that, but you know, he was a special case. So I think that it's a lot easier for them now, from an ideological point of view, because communism isn't there. They can recruit people using elements of Putinism, you know, the social conservatism, the West is decadent, we need to have a multipolar world, they can do bits of that. Or they can just do it simply in terms of greed. But when we were facing existential struggle against communism, which was, I think indubitably, or it was very, most people believed that communism was basically evil. And if you're working for the Russians, you're working for an evil ideology that had killed tens of millions of people and kept hundreds of millions in slavery. That was quite a hard sell. Now you can say, come off it, we're no worse than the Americans. Let's get back to talking about how much money you need for this. So I think they've got a big advantage on that. I think the other big advantage they've got is that Russia is so much more integrated into the West. In the old days, if you had a Russian who said, I'm a Soviet businessman, and I would like to discuss a contract with you, maybe in Austria you could get away with that. Austria being sort of supreme profiteer from all sorts of Cold War chicanery. I'm not being mean about the Austrians, it's just a fact. But it was very difficult to masquerade as a Soviet businessman in the Cold War era without questions. Now everybody's happy to do business with Russia. We have things like the US-Russia Trade Council. We have our diplomats and our embassies being urged, what are you doing to promote trade and investment with Russia? We want Russian foreign investment here, we want Russian contracts, we want to be able to sell stuff to Russians. And so the whole dynamic has changed. And although, in a way, that's great, I'm all in favour of it, but it does make it much easier for Russian intelligence if they want to get in somewhere. And then the second element of that is the people. Time was when Russians living in the West were very conspicuous. And if you wanted to put an illegal in the West, it was a very, very big deal indeed. Steal a Canadian birth certificate, find a Canadian baby who died at the right time, steal the birth certificate, and then, this was indeed used by one of the illegals who I wrote about in my book, Deception. The guy who called himself Donald Heathfield, who was in fact called Bezrukov, and he had a completely normal Canadian CV, except he actually came from Tomsk. And that was a very big deal. They put a lot of effort into that. Now they don't need to, because now they can send people abroad like Anna Chapman. They can send people who are exactly who they say they are. They don't have to worry about, are they going to reconcile their passport registry with their birth and death registry, which is a big problem for old-style illegals. They can say, hi, my name's Sasha. I came here when I was 20. I'm a Canadian citizen. I work in a travel agent. I'm just me. I'm Canadian, just like you. Now, 99 times out of 100, Sasha really is. Sasha, of course, being of either sex. But one time in 100, or maybe one time in 1,000, one time in 10,000, Sasha is actually not just working as a travel agent, she's emptying dead letterboxes, or she's helping build legends and cover stories for other people, or she's maybe actually doing real spying. Maybe she's sleeping with someone who works in an office that has very, very useful information. And it's very difficult for us to deal with that now, because we don't want to get back to the Cold War days of heavy scrutiny and vetting. I was the last generation of new BBC journalists to go through positive vetting, and it seemed faintly ridiculous even then. This was in the height of the Cold War, to have people going to my university tutor and saying, did you drink a lot? And these sort of questions. I don't think that vetting worked well, even in the Cold War. We certainly aren't going to go back to it now. But it's much, much harder when you have millions and millions of people from the former Soviet Union living in the West. There is one EU office, which I can't name because I promise not to, but there's an EU office which is directly involved in negotiations with Russia on something really, really important. And of the 4 secretaries in that office, every single one of them was born in the Soviet Union. 2 of them from countries which are now part of the EU, and 2 of them are naturalised citizens of West European countries. Now, maybe I'm just being frightfully suspicious, but, there's very little you can do about it. You can't say to these people, sorry, you can't work here because of where you were born. You can put them under some sort of scrutiny, but short of actually searching their houses and following their rights, it's very, very hard to know what to do. The only thing you can do, this is what I mentioned earlier, is prosecute. If you get caught, you go to jail for a long time. And that's a message which I think we've fundamentally failed to get across. At the moment, spying for Russia, or spying for anybody, particularly spying for Russia, is pretty much risk-free unless you're actually a government official, in which case you may lose your job or possibly go to jail if you're actually working in the intelligence services. But there's just been one prosecution in Europe now, and I was very pleased to see it, of a Danish professor, a Danish international relations professor, who was spying for the Russians, caught absolutely bound to rights, and he's gone to jail. And that was a big deal in Denmark, because he was just a professor. But they said treason's treason, and good for them.
Your description of Snowden reminds me of Kim Philby. Remember Kim Philby? Now I have a question. What is the percentage of Russian ethnics in Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania?
Thank you. First of all, I have to admit Kim Philby worked for The Economist briefly. I've been trying to redress the balance ever since. I'm very cautious about using this phrase ethnic Russians. This is Kremlin speak. The Kremlin has created the idea of Russian speaker as a political category. Now, I'm a Russian speaker. I'm an English speaker. You're an English speaker. Maybe other people here who are English speakers. Maybe people here are French speakers. Speaking a language is not a political category. It's a question of where you're brought up. It's partly a question of cultural choice. It's only the Kremlin that tries to make this in a way that absolutely echoes German thinking about ethnicity. The Volksgenossen is the exact predecessor of the compatriot idea of Putin. So I'm very suspicious. When you say ethnic Russian, well, does that mean if you're Tatar or Chuvash or Karelian or Buratian or Chechen, do you mean ethnic Russian as in any of the ethnicities that's part of the Russian Federation? Or does it mean if you have one parent who is an ethnic Russian? And do we have a kind of Nuremberg law which says how many Russian parents do you have to be to count as an ethnic Russian? Is it a question of the language you speak at home? Well, you have mixed marriages. You have people who speak one language at home, one language at work, one language to their parents, one to their wife, one language to one child, sometimes one to another. There's all sorts of choices people make about it. So I'm very suspicious about taking Soviet nationality policy and transferring it into free countries 20 years later. But for what it's worth, it's about 25%, bit under in Estonia, a bit more than that in Latvia, much less than that in Lithuania. But I'm deeply, deeply suspicious of this. I'm very happy to look at citizenship and say what percentage of the population have this passport. In the case of Estonia, it's a bit, I think, under 10% have Russian passports. And what percentage are non-citizens, don't have any? It's about 80,000 people. What percentage are Estonians? It's gone up a lot since independence. That's a real thing. You can even look at dual nationality, say how many people have dual citizenship. Again, a passport is a real thing. But this idea of ethnic, I'm not sure.
Sorry, just his overall support. Right now, oil prices are high and everything else. He's being supported a lot. But how vulnerable is he? Because even after the Crimean situation, you saw these things of just people quietly, big protests in Moscow, etc. And how strong is it? If the economy started to turn the wrong way, how strong is he? And how would it put up with this cost of all this foreign stuff?
Well, I think that's a brilliant question. And my short answer is we should be trying to intensify all his problems. And there's plenty we could do, and we're not doing it. You're right that the Putin modernization project has failed. He had 14 years of unlimited popularity and effectively unlimited money. He could have done anything he wanted. At the end, Russia hasn't changed that much. It's still got a terrible education system, public health, transport, infrastructure, power network. Enormous amounts of money have been stolen and diverted. And the aim he set back in 2000 just hasn't been met. Russia has not become a modern world-class country in really any respect, even the things that it's really, I would say it's a world-class power in intelligence. It hangs on in some bits of its military because of the huge amounts of money that's been put in there. It has a reasonable, it's a space power. But if you look for excellence in Russia, in most other things, you don't find it. It's been a very sad story. And Russians kind of know that. If you do opinion polling in Russia, you say, are you happy with your public services? No. Are you happy with the level of corruption? No. Are you happy with the life prospects for your children? No. Are you happy with the way the court system works? No. Are you happy with the police? No. Are you happy? No. And you say, do you like Putin? Yes! And that's what psychologists call cognitive dissonance. And it's well worth exploring, because it's not the Russians are stupid. One of the reasons is there's no alternative. I know many Russians who say, if it wasn't Putin, it'd be someone worse. Either we'll have chaos again, like in the 90s, and the country could fall apart, it'd be another Yugoslavia, or we might get a real fascist. So although, sure, Putin's corrupt and he's incompetent, but he's the best we've got. So Putin has a bit of inertia from that point of view. He's also got considerable reserves. He can still exploit. Russia doesn't really have much debt on the state level. It has lots of Russian companies have debt, but they can always default on that. They've done it in the past. He's got the big gas grip on Europe still for the next few years. But I think the real answer to your question actually is that he's in a hurry. He knows things are turning against him, and he needs a game changer. He needs a game changer that changes the rules of the way the West works. And I think that's what this is really all about. He doesn't really care about Slavyansk or Crimea or any of that stuff. What he needs to do is to play divide and rule in a way that destroys Western credibility. And he wants the Americans out of Europe, because that already changes the equation a lot for him. And it's kind of happening, but he wants to accelerate that process. He wants the Europeans to feel anti-American and the Americans to feel exasperated and distracted and fed up with Europe. And he wants most of all to change the rules on European energy. The single biggest threat to Putin is the EU's energy policy, which is busting his business model. It's making it illegal and impossible for him to extort differential prices from different countries. It's making it illegal and impossible for him to have vertically integrated gas assets in these countries. It's delinking the gas price from the oil price. It's encouraging diversification of supply. It's encouraging interconnectors, which means that it's hard to punish one country over another. It's doing all the stuff he doesn't like. It's doing it too slow. I wish it was doing faster, but it's great that it's happening at all. So I think what he's really hoping for is some kind of political crisis, at the end of which he's able to go to certain European countries and say, here's the deal. You entrench me as your preferred long-term energy supplier for gas, oil, coal and nuclear fuel. And in return for that, you get a very good political deal and I'll leave you alone. And there's only a hypothesis, I've got no real evidence for this, but the brilliant Warsaw think tank, the OSW, has just done a piece on this, on the gas agenda behind what Putin's doing in Ukraine. But he hasn't got much time, another 5 years, and his gas weapon won't work anymore. And also in another 5 years, the Russian public may have got out of its kind of nationalist frenzy, which it's in at the moment, and the joy of recapturing these lost territories, or just be thinking again, why is my life so bad?
First of all, thank you very much. It was a very enlightening speech. I actually went to school in the UK. I went to King's and I went to St. Andrews. My background is intelligence and national security, so I found it very enlightening. However, I've recently returned to Canada, and what I found the most interesting is the generation gap. It's the way that Canadian universities teach what's happening in the world, and particularly with relation to Snowden, it was very much centered on privacy and surveillance concerns, which is obviously a concern, but so is the Russian element that you mentioned. And that is my question. With regards to the media and the way that the media is very fictitious nowadays, and that you have blogs, and it's very youth-led in the media scene, and their priority is surveillance and privacy, how do you deal with Russia? How do you deal with RT? How do you deal with a very central mechanism, which is very much ingrained, and you mentioned that Russia has managed to develop, and how can the West try to counter this, and how can we educate the youth about a little bit more than just privacy concerns?
Yeah. Well, if I really knew the answer, I'd be out doing it. So you've asked a question to which I'm not sure I have a complete answer. I think there are several things we could do. One is to point out that for a lot of these idealistic people, many of whose views I share and admire, Putin is the epitome of what they don't like. You know, if you worry about, Dick Cheney and Halliburton, if you worry about big oil's role in American foreign policy, then you should be 100 times more worried about Rosneft and Gazprom. Putin has the worst things that happen in the West happen 100 times over in Russia, and nobody can write about it because there's no free media, or at least there is a free media, but it's so marginalised that it can't really cope. So I think that accepting the critique of the West is in many respects a good one. I share it. I wish my country was better. I wish it was free and safer and stronger and funnier and less rain and everything. But you mustn't have double standards. You've got to apply those same critique. You've got to apply it to Putin. And on any objective measure, Russia is worse. It treats its people abominably. Regime steals tens of billions of dollars every year from the Russian people, who live miserable lives for the most part. And then, and this is the second point, they use it to corrupt the West. And one of the lines I find that works very well is saying that it's absolutely disgusting the way that our professions, our lawyers and our bankers and our consultants and accountants, have bent all the rules in order to get Russian money into the City of London. We've turned the City of London into a vast money laundering machine for the Russians. And it's absolutely astonishing. You know, Rosneft is based on stolen property. Rosneft is feasted on the corpse of Yukos. Yukos had $8 billion worth of shares which belonged to Western investors. That was our money. And it went south. Yukos was ripped to pieces, and the bits were fed to Rosneft in a completely disgraceful sham way. Part of that involved PwC, one of our supposedly respectable auditing companies, withdrawing its audit from Yukos in order that the Russians could then say, make their charges of tax evasion stick. One of the big problems for the Russians when they tried to dismember Yukos was it had absolutely lickety-split clean audits of PwC. So the Russians went to PwC and said, you withdraw that audit, otherwise you lose all your Russian clients. Now I think that was a real Munich moment for the Western accountancy profession. They should have said, sorry, that's the point about audits, people rely on them. Bring us some new information, maybe we'll look at it again. We're not going to do it in threats. They should have said to them, fine, we'll all clear out. All the big four, 5 in those days, we're going to clear out of Moscow and you won't have Western audits anymore. Instead of which, PwC issued the lamest press release ever. This was like Chamberlain's piece in our time, saying it's come to our notice that the former management of Yukos is relying on our audit in their argument against the Russian government, and we therefore have no option but to withdraw it. And that, to me, just discredited the entire accountancy profession. You know, and they are the absolute gatekeepers of integrity in our financial system. So to your kind of naive, well-meaning Canadian student who thinks that people in suits are wicked and sinister, I say, well, here's a really good example, so join me in the fight.
We have 2 questions up front here after you, sir.
Yeah.
Mr. Lucas, my question follows a little bit on the security and privacy theme. Snowden hero, Snowden traitor, the whole debate that's in between, where some are commenting he was a traitor, but the release of these documents has exposed a certain amount, and with calls for increased oversight review of intelligence agencies. I'd be interested in some of your comments or your perspective, based on what you said at the very beginning of your talk, and where you see the changes that have occurred already in the United States. There's talk about an absence of a similar debate in Canada that's been going on, and how you see the impact on the review and oversight of intelligence.
Right. I start from a position that it's never going to work perfectly. I think espionage is essentially involves stealing secrets and breaking laws and tricking people. That's an odd thing for a government to do, essentially. And so espionage is never going to be a good fit within government, and there's never going to be a perfect way of doing intelligence oversight. If you let the politicians too close to the machinery, they start getting too interested and they start interfering too much, and you've got a great danger of intelligence being misused for political purposes. If you let the politicians too far away, then you get a different set of dangers, and you get the kind of J. Edgar Hoover and all the rest of it. So I think I always start by saying there's never going to be a perfect solution, and whatever you do will have advantages and disadvantages. To me, although America has the toughest system of intelligence oversight in the world, and it's a very good point to make to the Snowdenistas when they're complaining about it, say, which other country has 2 houses of Congress with intelligence committees that have the power of the Senate and House Intelligence Committee? Which other country has something like the FISA court with all that, its powers? Which other country has inspectors general in its intelligence services of the kind that you have in the American intelligence community? And so on and so forth. You put that together, and America, you can argue it should be tougher. You can argue it hasn't worked. You can argue it should be more. But I think not to apply that standard to other countries, such as France, where everything happens out of the Élysée on the single say-so of the President's intelligence coordinator, who's not an elected official, not subject to judicial scrutiny, and he can they, as we see from the Rainbow Warrior case, the French can have people killed just like that, if they want. They can blow things up. And so I think you've got to have a sense of, see this in a wider spectrum. My own personal feeling as a Brit is that I think the American system is too intrusive and too cumbersome. And I say that not so much from a worry of politicians misusing intelligence. I just think it consumes an immense amount of resources. And I want from my point of view as a taxpayer, I want my intelligence and security agencies to get on and do their job and not constantly be looking over their shoulder and worrying about the next hearing and think, oh, Senator so-and-so is a bit funny about that. I need a bone to throw the senator at the next closed hearing. So I'm not actually, although I use the American system as a way of arguing against the Snowdenistas who think more scrutiny is ipso facto better, to me, I think it's over the top. It consumes a huge number of people, huge amount of time, and I'm not sure it actually does a very good job in stopping abuses. I think the real reform I would push in America is to get rid of contractualization. I think contractualization is a monstrosity. I think that to me, contractualization is like having private police forces or private judges or private prison guards. You have people who are using the equivalent of lethal force on behalf of the state and dealing with information that's been stolen at very high cost and at great risk. And I want that to be done by civil servants, and I don't really want private contractors. Maybe private cleaners, but actually even then, I don't really want that, because that would immediately becomes a target for the other side to try and infiltrate the cleaners. So if I could do anything, I would change contractualization.
Quick question. Lieutenant Colonel Mike Clary, I feel like I'm at staff college and I have another pre-reading before a guest speaker. I haven't read any of your books, but I'm interested. Have the way things have developed, particularly in Ukraine, been what you anticipated, or have there been any surprises to you?
Thanks. I wrote The New Cold War in 2007. It was published in 2008. And it was the most savage and gloomy thing that had ever been written about Putin's Russia, to the point that my boss was quite worried about it coming out with any mention that I was to do with The Economist. I'd finished as Moscow bureau chief, not exactly in disgrace, but certainly as a lone outlier, as someone who'd been absolutely against Putin from the very beginning and deeply sceptical about the Chekist sort of security state in Russia from before Putin, because I think Putin intensified a process that was already there even in the 90s. It came at a time when Litvinenko while I was writing it, Litvinenko had been killed, Politkovsky had been shot. People were just beginning to realise that there was something quite bad going on. And then the Georgian War came straight after it was published. And one of the big warnings in the first edition was, watch out for Georgia. This is it was going very bad. So that was kind of vindication. But I got some things wrong. I didn't realise that military modernisation was going to work. I have a line somewhere in the first edition, which I think I've now managed to cut out, which says Russia can only invade small countries it can drive to. We now see that it can invade small bits of large countries that it doesn't need to drive to because it's already there. And I think that I was quite sceptical for a long time about Russian military modernisation, but it is happening. You just see this may be only the best bit of their forces, but if you're being attacked by well-armed, well-trained Spetsnaz, it's no comfort to know that the large chunks of the Russian army are still sort of going to bed hungry every night because they're not the ones who are attacking you. I think their ability on a whole range of things, the electronics, command and control, developing, they've got some impressive new missiles which are seriously worrying from an area denial point of view, to the point that NATO is now seriously worried about how it reinforces the Baltic states if the Russians decide to use their missiles in area. We don't want to have to go nuclear in order to land troops at Tallinn airfield or Amari airfield. So there's a serious shift in the balance of power, which I didn't get into the book. So the main message of the first book was worry about banks, not tanks. I now see you have to be worried about banks and tanks.
2 more questions, please.
Hi, Mr. Lucas. You asked for hostile questions, so here I go.
Okay.
I want to know if you dispute the fact that the majority of people in Crimea wanted to join the Russian Federation.
Okay, good. When you do an opinion poll, I'm basically against opinion polls, and I always, when I'm editing things at The Economist, I always try not to have stories that are based on a poll set, because opinion polls are not democracy any more than elections are democracy. Democracy is a process about everything that happens in between elections and how the people who are voted are held to account, the context in which elections happen, and so on. So I don't doubt that in that snap poll, the votes were more or less cast as they were counted. But if you go back only a year ago to the very detailed study that the IRI did, which I tweeted, if you follow me on being young, you understand Twitter. If you follow me on Twitter for about 6 weeks ago, but I think you can search it, I tweeted an IRI study, which was a 30-page study of Crimean opinion, very convenient. They did it in, I think, the early 2013. And there were lots and lots of questions about what telly do you watch and what do you want for your future and so on. But there were only 8% of people wanted independence. The vast majority wanted autonomy within Ukraine, which is what they had. Now, could it be better autonomy? I'm sure it could. You can always fiddle around. As you know, in this country, perhaps better than any other country in the world, there are endless constitutional tweaks and complications you can go to satisfy people who want to have a particular status within some kind of structure. And I wouldn't be against Ukraine being a federation if it wanted to be. These are all choices that people can make. But what you can't do is make these choices with a gun to your head. And the way in which Russia went about that referendum involved breaking every bit of the commitments they'd made to Ukraine in the previous 24 years, starting with the Paris Charter of 1990, the Budapest Memorandum of 1994, which I guess, does everybody here know what the Budapest Memorandum was? Okay, for those who don't, this was a deal with Britain, America and Russia, with the French anxiously scrambling on behind saying we're a nuclear power too, in which the Ukrainians agreed to give up their nuclear weapons, which they'd inherited at the end of the Soviet Union, and in return for a solemn promise from the three main nuclear powers and the French, sorry, I couldn't resist that, and I think the Chinese signed up to it as well, saying that Ukraine would never Ukraine's borders were inviolable, they'd be never put under any form of coercion. And that was quite a big deal. It was a kind of basis for getting other countries to give up their nuclear weapons too. And I find one of the big hidden dangers of this is that we've
this
now
concludes today's webcast.
If we wanted to do a Budapest
on behalf of the RCMI, this is Eric Morse saying thank you for listening. You can keep up with coming events at the RCMI by visiting our website at www.rcmi.org. We hope you tune in again, and we hope to see you in person at coming events.
So these things come at a cost.
Goodbye.
And if you have information warfare, which the Russians are very good at, and you focus it, as they've admitted to doing, you focus it very hard on an already alienated bit of the population, at a time when a country is facing both a financial and a political crisis. And then you have a referendum which the other side isn't allowed to campaign, in which there's no countervailing weight in the media, and where the question doesn't actually include, I'd like to stay as we are. The question was only, do you want to be independent, do you want to join Russia? Then I don't think that referendum has validity. So I don't dispute, but democracy is not about every slice of the public, however you define it, suddenly being able to get what it wants instantly. You can't run a political system like that. Political systems are about institutions, about making changes slowly over time with the consent of other people who are affected. And don't forget, 1/3 of the population of Crimea is now in a terrible situation. The Tatars, who I think are the most tragic victims of this whole thing, the people who were deported en masse in one night by Stalin to Central Asia, 1/3 of them died within the first year. They come back at the end of the Soviet period, and they still don't have their land back. Imagine if you come back to your hometown after 50 years away. It has a different name, there's somebody else living in your house, all the street names have changed, your graveyard's been obliterated, and your church isn't there anymore, maybe it's been turned into a store or a supermarket or cinema or something. That's what the Tatars have. They live in sheds on the edges of the villages that they once owned. And now they're being, again, marginalised, and the leader of the Crimean Tatars has been told he can't come back. It's the second time in his life he's been deported, once by Stalin, and now by Putin. So, will of majority is a very interesting thing. Always deserves closer examination.
If by a stretch, Putin could be considered a modern-day, jumped-up, self-appointed czar, is there any possibility, in your opinion, that there could be a modern-day revolution?
Well, revolutions happen for lots of different reasons, and I think that I think you're more likely. I think you've got to separate Russian politics into a business model, a regime, and the personality of Putin, and they're all slightly different. The business model is based on the collection and distribution of rents. These are bureaucratic rents and natural resource rents. Bureaucratic rents is a polite word for bribes. Natural resource rents is a polite word for stealing from the oil and gas companies. And the system hoovers these billions and billions and billions of dollars up, and then it distributes them among, with some going to things like the armed forces, the intelligence services, a bit into public spending, other bits of public spending, and a lot into the pockets of the regime. So the regime, like that business model, the regime is, I would call, roughly 1,000 people, with maybe a sort of inner core of 100 and a very inner core of 10. This is very, very, very schematic. But they're the people who really, really benefit from that. And Putin plays an important role there. He was the guy who the Yeltsin regime turned to in desperation to stop them being impeached, but they didn't turn to Putin because he was a big, strong guy. They turned to him because he was a dependable, rather weak, as they thought, obedient bureaucrat who wouldn't let them down. And he's become this sort of monster over the past 14 years. But he didn't start off like that. And he's still dependent on his two abilities. One is to settle feuds within the regime, because they all fight all the time. If you want to understand Russian politics, watch The Sopranos or The Godfather. It's like that. You've got these a mixture of gangsters and thugs, crooks and spooks, fighting each other all the time for power and money. And Putin has a pretty good record in being an arbiter of those differences. And the other advantage he's got is being the front guy. He's the guy who goes on telly and makes the Russian people feel, this is great, we don't mind we're being stolen from, but Russia's back, the country's stable, could be a lot worse, let's keep going like that. And he's vulnerable on both of those things. He's vulnerable on his ability to be an arbiter, because we've seen some interesting cracks between, for example, the oil and the gas lobby. And the strain is even greater now because some people are really hurting because of sanctions. And he's also vulnerable, I think, in his role as the front guy, because Russians are basically quite tired of him. They like getting Crimea back. This is good. Many Russians feel it belonged to them anyway, should never have been taken. They're glad it came back. They don't look too closely into how it happened. But basically Russians are fed up with Putin. They're bored with him. And his popularity was dropping quite sharply before this happened. So I think the most likely change, in answer to your question, is not that we'll have a change of the regime, we'll have a change in the regime. I think they could tweak the business model. They could just start being nice to the West again, because bankers are very greedy and very forgetful, and people will come flooding back in. They just talk some nice stuff, say, we're sorry about all this anti-Westernism, it's over now, and you get money pouring back in again, because everyone's looking for yield and emerging markets, and Russia still, from its fundamentals, looks like quite an interesting possibility. And so you could change the business model, and you could change the personality of Putin. You could change Putin. You could have a different front guy. And I think that could happen. But you still wouldn't change the regime, because they have got so much interest in doing this. This is tens of billions of dollars a year, and they will fight very, very hard to keep it. So I think a revolution against the regime is going to be very difficult. Are we done? Wow. Okay. Thank you.
This concludes our Spring 2014 season of Security Studies podcasts. Please join us again in September 2014, when we will be hosting you from our brand new RCMI headquarters on University Avenue in Toronto. We hope that those of you who can will join us in person as we begin the next century of RCMI history. For everyone at the RCMI, this is Eric Morse saying thank you for being with us, and until September, goodbye.